Professor Zwexel's tendrils rippled with disdain as he adjusted the holographic display showing Earth's recent space achievements. The prestigious Galactic Academy of Survival Studies had never admitted such a primitive species before, and he intended to prove why. "Observe," he announced to his class of advanced beings from across the galaxy. "These humans have barely mastered basic interplanetary travel. Their environmental adaptation techniques rely on crude external tools rather than proper biological engineering." His upper eyes narrowed as he gestured to the latest statistics. "They still depend on chemical rockets." Chemical rockets. The assembled students chittered and hummed in agreement. A Ventusian princess extended her crystalline appendages in what their species considered a laugh. Even the normally stoic Moravian delegation rippled their photosynthetic membranes in amusement. None of them noticed Dale Jensen quietly repairing the classroom's climate control unit in the corner. The maintenance worker kept his head down, focusing on the task at hand while the professor's words washed over him. Growing up in northern Minnesota, he'd heard plenty of people underestimate him before. "Tomorrow," Professor Zwexel continued, his voice charged with academic superiority, "we begin our practical survival trials on Glacius 7. Each of your species will demonstrate your evolved adaptation capabilities in extreme environments." He paused for dramatic effect. "Those who pass will be granted full academic admission to our esteemed institution." Dale's hands froze on the control panel. Glacius 7. He'd read about that ice planet in the maintenance logs, temperature readings that would make a Minnesota winter feel like a tropical vacation. The professor's secondary tendrils suddenly stiffened. "What's this?" He jabbed at his data pad. "There seems to be an administrative error. The system has included." His voice dripped with incredulity, "a human in tomorrow's trials." The classroom erupted in expressions of disbelief and amusement. Dale slowly stood up, wiping his hands on his coveralls. The professor's 4 eyes locked onto him. "Well," Zwexel said, mandibles clicking in barely concealed contempt, "it seems we'll have an excellent example of why certain species aren't ready for galactic academia. I predict this human won't last 10 minutes in Glacius 7's environment." Dale said nothing, but a slight smile played across his face as he packed up his tools. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, "Nature doesn't care about your fancy gadgets, boy. Learn to work with what she gives you, and you'll never freeze." The professor had said 10 minutes. Dale wondered if that would be enough time to build an igloo. The preparation chamber for Glacius 7 trials hummed with activity as various species checked their advanced survival gear. The Ventusian princess's crystalline form gleamed beneath layers of thermal regulators, while the Moravians adjusted their photosynthetic converters to process the ice planet's weak sunlight. Every participant had brought the finest technology their civilizations could offer, except Dale. "Here's your standard issue emergency kit," the supply officer droned, sliding a small package across the counter. "Though I don't know why we're wasting resources." The alien's voice trailed off as it noticed Professor Zwexel approaching. "Ah, our human participant," the professor announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I trust you understand the gravity of your situation." Glacius 7's surface temperature averages -150 degrees Celsius. Even our most advanced species find it challenging. Dale carefully opened the emergency kit, examining its contents: a basic thermal blanket, some nutrient packets, and a small energy cell. His mind drifted back to a winter morning 20 years ago, when his grandfather had dragged 12-year-old Dale out of bed at 4 a.m. "But Grandpa, it's -40 outside," he'd complained. "Exactly," his grandfather had replied, eyes twinkling. "Perfect weather for learning." They'd spent that entire weekend building different types of snow shelters. His grandfather, who'd learned from his own father, had shown Dale how to read the snow, to understand its texture and density. The Inuit peoples perfected these techniques over thousands of years, he'd explained. This isn't just survival, it's their heritage, their wisdom. Never let anyone tell you old ways are primitive. Human? Are you listening? Professor Zwexel's sharp tone snapped Dale back to the present. I asked if you'd like to withdraw from the trial. It would be understandable. Around them, other participants were running final diagnostics on their environmental suits and shelter generators. A group of Centaurian students nearby didn't even try to hide their amusement at Dale's simple kit. Did you forget your technology at home? One called out, their bioluminescent markings pulsing with mirth. Or does your species not have any? Dale carefully rolled up his sleeves and began methodically stretching his muscles, a pre-work routine learned from years of maintenance jobs in Minnesota's brutal winters. He noticed a few curious glances at the scars on his arms, souvenirs from ice fishing accidents and construction work. Professor, Dale spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but clear. How do you grade these trials? Zwexel's tendrils twitched in surprise at the question. Participants must demonstrate their ability to establish stable shelter and maintain core biological functions for 6 standard hours. But in your case... Perfect, Dale interrupted, reaching down to retie his boots. That's all I needed to know. The professor's 4 eyes blinked in succession. You seem remarkably calm for someone about to face certain failure. Dale stood up, his movements unhurried and deliberate. He pulled on a pair of well-worn work gloves, nothing special, just sturdy leather ones he'd treated with oil every winter since his grandfather gave them to him. You know, Professor, my people have a saying, winter is not a season, it's an occupation. The chamber's warning lights began to pulse, indicating 5 minutes until transport to the planet's surface. As the other participants made last-minute adjustments to their sophisticated gear, Dale took a deep breath of the warm air. His grandfather had taught him another lesson that day they'd built their first igloo: the cold doesn't care about your fancy equipment. It respects those who understand it. The Ventusian princess glided past, her crystalline form now completely encased in a powered environmental suit. I do hope your species' diplomatic relations won't suffer too much from this embarrassment, she chimed, her tone dripping with false sympathy. Dale simply smiled, flexing his fingers inside his old leather gloves. He'd spent his whole life working in the cold, learning its rules, respecting its power. These aliens, for all their advanced technology, saw winter as an enemy to be fought. They'd never learned what his grandfather had shown him, that sometimes, the best way to survive wasn't to fight nature, but to work with it. The final warning bell sounded. In moments, they would all be transported to the frozen surface of Glacius 7. As the teleportation field began to hum, Dale closed his eyes and recalled the smell of wood smoke from his grandfather's cabin, the sound of snow being packed into blocks, and the satisfaction of stepping into a shelter built by human hands. The teleportation field dissipated, and Glacius 7's brutal cold struck like a physical blow. Howling wind whipped clouds of fine snow across the stark white landscape, while 2 pale suns hung low on the horizon, offering more illumination than warmth. The temperature reading on the official monitoring station flashed, -157 degrees Celsius. Professor Zwexel's voice crackled through their communication devices. Your 6-hour survival trial begins now. Remember, you must establish shelter and maintain viable life signs throughout the duration. The assembled beings burst into action. The Ventusian princess immediately activated her thermal regulators, their crystalline surfaces beginning to hum, then sputter. The extreme cold was already affecting their power efficiency. Nearby, the Moravians' photosynthetic converters struggled to process the weak sunlight, their usual bright green membranes turning a sickly pale color. Dale stood motionless, eyes closed, feeling the wind's direction on his face. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory: first rule of winter survival, don't rush. Panic makes you sweat, and sweat kills. He opened his eyes and began to survey the snow around him, moving with deliberate purpose. Look at the human, one of the Centaurians called out, their environmental suits heating elements creating a visible distortion in the air. It's already frozen in fear. But Dale wasn't frozen, he was reading the snow. He moved slowly in a spiral pattern, occasionally kneeling to probe the surface with gloved hands, testing density and consistency. 20 years of winter work had taught him what his grandfather had always said: snow isn't just frozen water, it's building material, if you know how to use it. The wind intensified, driving the temperature even lower. The first signs of serious trouble began to appear among the other participants. The Ventusian princess's crystalline form had developed hairline fractures where her thermal regulators failed to compensate for the extreme cold. The Moravians huddled together, their makeshift shelter of energy fields flickering dangerously as power cells struggled in the harsh conditions. Professor Zwexel watched through the monitoring system, his tendrils twitching with growing concern. The human should have succumbed to the cold already, yet Dale continued his methodical survey of the area. "What is it doing?" the professor muttered, adjusting the sensors to focus on Dale's life signs. They were stable, not just stable, but showing none of the panic responses the other participants exhibited. Dale had found what he was looking for, a spot where the wind had packed the snow into dense, uniform layers. He began to cut blocks with practiced efficiency, using the simple snow knife from his emergency kit. His movements were swift but unhurried, each motion purposeful and precise. The teleportation field dissipated, and Glacier 7's brutal cold struck like a physical blow. Howling wind whipped clouds of fine snow across the stark white landscape, while two pale suns hung low on the horizon, offering more illumination than warmth. The temperature reading on the official monitoring station flashed, -157 degrees Celsius. Professor Zwexel's voice crackled through their communication devices: "Your 6-hour survival trial begins now. Remember, you must establish shelter and maintain viable life signs throughout the duration." The assembled beings burst into action. The Ventusian princess immediately activated her thermal regulators, their crystalline surfaces beginning to hum, then sputter. The extreme cold was already affecting their power efficiency. Nearby, the Moravians' photosynthetic converters struggled to process the weak sunlight, their usual bright green membranes turning a sickly pale color. Dale stood motionless, eyes closed, feeling the wind's direction on his face. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory: "First rule of winter survival, don't rush. Panic makes you sweat, and sweat kills." He opened his eyes and began to survey the snow around him, moving with deliberate purpose. "Look at the human," one of the Centaurians called out, their environmental suits heating elements creating a visible distortion in the air. "It's already frozen in fear." But Dale wasn't frozen, he was reading the snow. He moved slowly in a spiral pattern, occasionally kneeling to probe the surface with gloved hands, testing density and consistency. 20 years of winter work had taught him what his grandfather had always said: snow isn't just frozen water, it's building material, if you know how to use it. The wind intensified, driving the temperature even lower. The first signs of serious trouble began to appear among the other participants. The Ventusian princess's crystalline form had developed hairline fractures where her thermal regulators failed to compensate for the extreme cold. The Moravians huddled together, their makeshift shelter of energy fields flickering dangerously as power cells struggled in the harsh conditions. Professor Zwexel watched through the monitoring system, his tendrils twitching with growing concern. The human should have succumbed to the cold already, yet Dale continued his methodical survey of the area. "What is it doing?" the professor muttered, adjusting the sensors to focus on Dale's life signs. They were stable, not just stable, but showing none of the panic responses the other participants exhibited. Dale had found what he was looking for, a spot where the wind had packed the snow into dense, uniform layers. He began to cut blocks with practiced efficiency, using the simple snow knife from his emergency kit. His movements were swift but unhurried, each motion purposeful and precise. The Centaurian who had mocked him earlier now watched in confusion as their own shelter generator began to fail, its power cells freezing in the intense cold. "How is the human still functioning?" they demanded, their bioluminescent markings pulsing with distress. Its primitive covering should have frozen solid by now. But Dale knew something they didn't. Proper winter work wasn't about fighting the cold, it was about working with it. His grandfather had taught him that lesson on countless winter mornings. "See how the snow holds together," he'd explained. "Nature gives you what you need, if you know where to look." As the first hour of the trial came to an end, the situation had become critical for many participants. Sophisticated environmental systems were failing one by one, unable to cope with conditions far more extreme than their designers had anticipated. The Ventusian princess's crystalline form had developed severe cracks, forcing her to call for emergency extraction. Two of the Moravians, their photosynthetic processes nearly shut down, soon followed. Through it all, Dale continued his work, the blocks taking shape in a spiral pattern. His movements had kept him warm enough, but not so active as to break a sweat. The other participants, those whose technology hadn't completely failed, began to take notice. There was something happening here that defied their understanding of survival principles. Professor Zwexel's voice crackled through the communication system again, tight with concern, multiple participants requiring extraction. All remaining candidates, be aware that conditions are projected to worsen over the next hour. Dale allowed himself a small smile as he fitted another block into place. The wind that had caused so much trouble for the others' force fields and energy shields now worked in his favor, naturally filling any gaps between the snow blocks with fine powder. His grandfather would have appreciated the irony. Sometimes, the old man had said, the simplest solution is the strongest. People forget that because they're too busy looking for complicated answers. As the second hour of the trial began, Dale's structure was taking clear shape. The other participants, their technological solutions failing around them, couldn't help but stare at the emerging shelter. It was nothing like their sophisticated environmental systems, and yet, somehow, it was exactly what the situation required. The remaining participants watched in fascination as Dale placed the final blocks at the top of his structure. What had begun as a puzzling series of snow blocks had transformed into a perfect dome, its spiral construction creating an architectural strength that even the Centaurians' advanced engineering sensors were beginning to register with interest. Professor Zwexel's voice crackled through their communicators, 3 hours remaining. Current surface temperature dropping to -163 degrees Celsius. His tone carried a note of concern that none of his students had ever heard before. Already, half of the participants had required emergency extraction due to equipment failure. Dale crawled through the entrance of his igloo, remembering another of his grandfather's lessons: the entrance always goes down, boy. Hot air rises, cold air sinks. Let nature do the work for you. The tunnel entrance dipped below the igloo's floor level, creating a cold sink that would trap the frigid air while allowing warmer air to circulate above. Inside, Dale used his snow knife to create a small ventilation hole at the top. The watching aliens were baffled by this seeming mistake. The Centaurian student whose environmental suit was barely functioning spoke up, their bioluminescent markings pulsing with confusion. It's deliberately creating a breach in its shelter? Perhaps the cold has affected its reasoning. But Dale knew better. As his grandfather had taught him, an igloo without ventilation is like a boat without a bilge pump, bound for disaster. The small hole would prevent carbon dioxide buildup while maintaining the shelter's thermal efficiency. The professor's sensors were registering something that challenged his understanding of primitive technology. The temperature inside Dale's shelter was rising steadily, already 40 degrees warmer than the external environment, and it was doing so without any power source. Impossible, Zwexel muttered, adjusting his instruments. It's achieving better thermal efficiency than our advanced environmental systems, using nothing but frozen water? The remaining aliens watched as Dale emerged briefly to gather some loose snow. Back inside, he used it to seal any gaps between the blocks, creating an almost perfectly smooth interior surface. Each action was deliberate, born from generations of knowledge passed down through harsh winters. A particularly violent gust of wind caused the Moravians' energy shield to flicker dangerously. Their photosynthetic membranes were now a pale, sickly white, struggling to process the weak sunlight. The Centaurian suit electronics were crackling with frost damage, its power reserves dropping into critical levels. Dale stuck his head out of the igloo entrance. "There's room in here," he called out, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "It'll be a tight fit, but it's better than freezing." The aliens hesitated, their pride warring with their survival instincts. Another blast of wind, even colder than before, made the decision for them. One by one, they shut down their failing systems and crawled through the entrance tunnel. Inside, they found Dale calmly sitting on his thermal blanket, which he'd spread on the raised sleeping platform he'd built into the igloo's design. The temperature, while still well below freezing, was dramatically warmer than outside. More surprisingly, it was stable, without the fluctuations that had plagued their powered systems. "How?" the Centaurian asked, their markings pulsing with genuine curiosity now. "How is it maintaining thermal stability without power?" Dale smiled, reaching out to touch the interior wall. "The snow itself provides the insulation. Body heat does the rest. The dome shape prevents dripping as the interior surface forms a thin glaze of ice. Simple geometry and basic physics, no power needed." Professor Zwexel's voice came through their communicators again, but this time with a different tone. "Remarkable. The human shelter is maintaining optimal survival conditions with zero technological input. I'm registering stable life signs for all occupants." The Moravians' membranes had begun to regain some of their color in the relative warmth. "Our archives suggest that some species developed non-technological survival strategies," one of them noted, "but we had assumed such methods were obsolete." Dale thought about all the winter nights he'd spent learning from his grandfather, about the wisdom that had been passed down through generations. "Sometimes," he said, "the old ways are the best ways. Technology can fail, but knowledge, real, practical knowledge, that stays with you." Outside, the wind continued to howl, and the temperature dropped even further. But inside the igloo, built with nothing more than snow and knowledge, a group of diverse beings from across the galaxy was learning a lesson about the difference between Adva. The first warning came as a deep, subsonic rumble that Dale felt in his bones. Having spent winters storm spotting for his local weather service, he recognized the sound of approaching danger. The aliens, huddled in the relative warmth of the igloo, noticed his sudden alertness. "Something's wrong," Dale said, pressing his ear against the igloo wall. The snow carried sound in a way that had saved his life more than once during Minnesota blizzards. Professor Zwexel's voice crackled through their communicators with unprecedented urgency. "Emergency alert. A massive cryostorm is approaching your position. Estimated wind speeds exceeding 300 kilometers per hour. Immediate extraction." The transmission cut off abruptly. The Centaurians' bioluminescent markings flashed in panic. The storm must be interfering with the teleportation fields. "We're stranded." Outside, the twin suns vanished as the storm front arrived, plunging the landscape into an eerie twilight. The temperature, already brutally low, began to plummet even further. The Moravians' membranes vibrated with distress as their sensors registered the dropping numbers. "The storm's magnetic interference is affecting all remaining power systems," one of them reported, their voice trembling. "Even if our shelters were still functioning, they wouldn't survive this." Dale closed his eyes, remembering another lesson from long ago. His grandfather had taken him ice fishing when an unexpected storm had cut off their way back to shore. "The trick to surviving extremes," he'd said while showing young Dale how to reinforce their ice shelter, "is understanding that you're not fighting against nature, you're building with it." "We need to strengthen the igloo," Dale announced, already moving toward the entrance. The storm will try to lift the dome. We need to counter that force. The aliens watched in confusion as Dale began to explain what needed to be done. The Centaurian, their environmental suit now completely dead, spoke up. But how can we work in these conditions? Even your primitive shelter will need power to. No power, Dale interrupted, pulling his work gloves tighter. Just knowledge and cooperation. Your species are all adapted to different environments, right? We can use that. What followed was unlike anything the Galactic Academy had seen in its centuries of existence. Under Dale's guidance, each being contributed according to their natural abilities. The Centaurian's bioluminescence provided light in the growing darkness. The Moravian's sensitive membranes could detect subtle changes in air pressure, helping predict the storm's strongest gusts. Even the crystalline structure of the remaining Ventusian's partly damaged form proved useful in reinforcing crucial stress points in the snow blocks. Dale showed them how to build a wind barrier, angling additional snow blocks to deflect the worst of the gusts. His grandfather's voice seemed to guide his hands: work with the wind, not against it. Let it pack the snow tighter for you. As the storm reached its peak, their shelter held firm while the remains of the abandoned technological shelters were swept away like leaves. Inside the igloo, the diverse group of beings huddled together, sharing warmth and, gradually, stories. The Moravians spoke of their ancient history, before they developed photosynthetic technology. The Centaurian admitted that their ancestors had once used bioluminescence for more than just communication. The Ventusian princess revealed that her species had originally lived in natural crystal caves before developing their synthetic habitats. Perhaps, she said, her crystalline form catching the gentle light of the Centaurian's markings, we have relied too heavily on technology, forgetting the natural adaptations that helped our species survive in the first place. Dale nodded, thinking of all the winter nights he'd spent learning from his grandfather, understanding now that those lessons were more than just survival skills, they were a connection to a deeper wisdom about living in harmony with nature rather than trying to dominate it. The storm raged on, but inside their reinforced shelter, something remarkable was happening. Beings from across the galaxy were rediscovering that survival didn't always require the most advanced technology, sometimes it just needed understanding, cooperation, and respect for traditional knowledge that had been tested by time and elements. Professor Zyxl, watching through the few sensors that still functioned, observed in amazement as the group not only survived but thrived in conditions that should have been unsurvivable. The humans' primitive shelter was proving more resilient than any of their advanced systems, and more importantly, it was bringing together species that had never before considered working as equals. As the hours passed and the storm showed no signs of weakening, Dale taught his fellow survivors more traditional survival techniques. He showed them how to read the snow's consistency, how to work with the wind rather than against it, and how to trust in solutions that had been proven over generations rather than just the latest technology. You know, Dale said, as they listened to the storm howling outside their secure shelter, my grandfather used to say that the most powerful technology is the one that works when everything else fails. The others nodded in understanding, their previous prejudices about primitive methods dissolving in the face of their shared survival. They were learning that true advancement wasn't always about creating something new, sometimes it was about respecting and understanding what already worked. When the storm finally passed and teleportation systems came back online, the Galactic Academy's emergency response team found something unprecedented. Instead of casualties or traumatized survivors, they discovered a group of beings from different species huddled in a snow shelter, sharing stories and knowledge as if they'd known each other for years. Professor Zyxl materialized at the sight, his tendrils twitching with barely contained excitement as he circled the igloo. Remarkable construction. The aerodynamics alone. He paused, noticing how the storm's fierce winds had actually compacted and strengthened the structure rather than destroying it. Simply remarkable. The Academy's analysis teams descended on the site, their sophisticated instruments scanning every aspect of Dale's shelter. The data they collected challenged fundamental assumptions about survival technology. The Igloo's efficiency wasn't just comparable to their advanced systems, in many ways, it was superior. But how did you know it would work in conditions far more extreme than anything on Earth? One researcher asked Dale as the group emerged from their shelter. Dale thought about all the winter mornings he'd spent with his grandfather, learning to read the snow and wind. Principles, he said simply. Good principles work anywhere. The laws of physics don't change just because we're on a different planet. The Ventusian princess, her crystalline form still showing signs of the ordeal, addressed the gathering of Academy officials. We have witnessed something that our advanced civilizations had forgotten. There is wisdom in what we once dismissed as primitive methods. The Centaurian student, whose bioluminescent markings are now pulsed with patterns of respect when looking at Dale, added, "The human showed us that true adaptation isn't about having the most advanced technology, it's about understanding and working with your environment." In the Academy's Grand Hall later that day, Professor Zwexel did something unprecedented in his centuries-long career. He admitted he had been wrong. His 4 eyes focused on Dale as he addressed the assembled faculty and students. "We have long equated advancement with complexity," the professor declared, his tendrils moving in patterns of formal academic acknowledgement. "We assumed that survival in extreme conditions required equally extreme technology. Today, we learned otherwise." The Moravians, their membranes now restored to full health, presented their analysis. They had discovered that the principles behind Dale's Igloo design could be adapted for various environments. The same understanding of natural forces and materials could be applied to desert worlds, gas giants, even space habitats. "Think about it," one Moravian explained, their membrane rippling with excitement. "We've been trying to force our environments to adapt to us through technology. Perhaps sometimes we should be adapting to our environments through understanding." Dale sat quietly during these proceedings, remembering his grandfather's words, "Knowledge isn't about showing off, boy. It's about understanding. Real understanding never goes out of style." The Academy's curriculum committee convened an emergency session. New courses were proposed: traditional survival techniques, environmental adaptation studies, and cross-species cooperation in extreme conditions. Dale was asked to contribute to their development, bringing generations of human experience to the galaxy's most advanced learning institution. But perhaps the most profound change was visible in the way the different species now interacted. The Ventusian princess, once dismissive of lesser beings, could be seen discussing shelter design with students from various backgrounds. The Centaurians began incorporating traditional methods into their advanced technological systems, creating hybrid solutions that were more reliable than either approach alone. Professor Zwexel found Dale in the Academy's observatory that evening, watching Glacia 7's twin sun set through the protective dome. "You've changed things here," the professor said quietly. "Changed us. We had forgotten that advancement doesn't always mean moving away from the past." Dale smiled, thinking of his grandfather's weathered hands showing him how to pack snow just right. "Sometimes," he replied, "the most advanced thing we can do is remember what we already know." Academic papers were already being prepared, analyzing how a primitive snow shelter had outperformed state-of-the-art environmental systems. But the real lesson went deeper than technical specifications. It was about respect for traditional knowledge, for different approaches to problems, and for the wisdom that comes from working with nature rather than trying to overcome it. The final section opens with Professor Zwexel standing before the Galactic Academy's Grand Assembly Hall, a space typically reserved for the most prestigious announcements. The atmosphere is charged with anticipation, the hall filled with representatives from countless civilizations. "Colleagues," Zwexel begins, her voice trembling slightly with a mix of humility and newfound respect, "I stand before you today to admit a profound error in my understanding of human potential." The holographic display behind her shows Dale's Igloo, now a symbol of unexpected survival and wisdom. The public acknowledgement is more than just an apology, it's a complete paradigm shift. ZYXL details how Dale's traditional knowledge not only saved the entire experimental group but revealed critical gaps in the Academy's approach to survival studies. The professor presents a comprehensive analysis of how indigenous techniques, honed over thousands of years, can sometimes surpass the most advanced technological solutions. As a surprise to everyone, Dale is invited to the stage. Dressed simply in practical clothing that contrasts with the elaborate attire of alien academics, Dale appears both humble and confident. The maintenance worker turned survival expert shares stories of indigenous knowledge from Earth, tales of Arctic peoples, desert nomads, and rainforest communities who have survived in extreme conditions for generations. The Academy makes a groundbreaking decision, the creation of a new interdisciplinary course titled Traditional Survival Techniques, Wisdom Beyond Technology. Dale is offered a teaching position, not as a token gesture, but as a genuine recognition of expertise. The course will bring together survival knowledge from across the galaxy, with a special emphasis on techniques developed by indigenous cultures. In a deeply emotional moment, the alien students who previously mocked Dale now approach with genuine respect. They ask questions, eager to learn about the human approach to survival that they had previously dismissed as primitive. The narrative concludes with a reflective scene. Dale stands by the window of the Academy, looking out at the vast expanse of space, thinking about the journey from being a maintenance worker to becoming a respected instructor. The Igloo, now a holographic model in the Academy's museum, serves as a constant reminder that wisdom comes in many forms. The final paragraph drives home the central message: true innovation isn't about the most complex technology, but about understanding, adaptation, and respect for knowledge developed over generations. It's a celebration of human resilience, indigenous wisdom, and the power of breaking through cultural prejudices. Thematic resonance. Validation of traditional knowledge. Importance of cultural humility. Power of demonstration over argumentation. Respect for diverse forms of intelligence. Universal value of practical wisdom.